Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the world of the New Testament in our survey of the New Testament. If we look at a map of the Middle East, we notice immediately that there's a desert region starting from the Atlantic, going through Africa, through the Middle East, all the way to the Hindu Kush, and in the middle of that is a river system, actually two river systems, the Nile River and the Euphrates-Tigris river systems, which we call Mesopotamia. That square that we've outlined on our map is the center for nearly all of the history of the Old Testament. When we come to the New Testament, the square changes a bit. Notice there's a westward movement that takes in Greece and takes in Italy, but our story still begins in the Middle East. So we're going to start off by looking at this area of Canaan, this area in the Middle East that today we know as Israel. Israel in the days of Jesus. Notice the two, well, we have Mediterranean and then the two fairly small bodies of water, the Dead Sea in the south and the Sea of Galilee in the north. If we were to take a cross-section of this area going from west to east, we would notice first the seacoast plain, and then there's a large mountain ridge that runs north to south, broken, yes, by the valley of Jezreel. And then continuing east beyond that, I find a depression, a great valley at the Dead Sea. It's 1,400 feet below sea level. And then again, rising up from that, I have the Jordanian highlands to the east beyond that. The southern area of that land had come to have the name Judea. Its old name was Judah, but it was now a Roman province. The Romans had come in and taken over. And so I have Judea, I have Samaria as I move northward. This was a separate political entity as well as a separate ethnic people that were living here. And then continuing north, I have the land of Galilee. The word Galilee means circle, and it refers to that area, the circle around the Sea of Galilee. To the east, I have the Decapolis. This was actually a word meaning the 10 cities. Deca, like a decalogue, would be the 10 words. The Decapolis were the 10 Greek cities that had settled in that area to the east of the Jordan River. If I can compare the differences, and this only works for you if you live in the South Florida area, sorry if you live somewhere else and are listening to this, but I've put a map of the South Florida area with Miami and Fort Lauderdale and some of our surrounding communities right next to a map of Israel to get an idea of the distances. We're not talking about a great deal of distances from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, around 50, 60 miles. So it's everything in this story is taking place within a fairly close geographical range. First, I'd like to take you to Caesarea, Herod's city by the sea. Herod the Great, realizing that Israel does not have any natural harbors, set out to manufacture one, and he had great pilings sunk out into the sea to build a artificial breakwater. It was a cultural place. It still is, in fact. You can go to the theater that was built by Herod, and even to this day it is used for modern day concerts and the like. Herod also had a hippodrome, a big place for chariot racing, built here on his city of Caesarea. Also, there was a freshwater pool. Of course, there's saltwater out there in the Mediterranean, but he had a freshwater swimming pool built right on the edge of the city, jutting out into the ocean. Here's another look at that pool. Caesarea was truly an amazing city. It had the breakwater, the lighthouses. It became a center of commerce, and it became the center of the Roman government for that part of the world. Because Caesarea had no natural springs, water had to be piped in through 3 very extensive and long aqueducts, bringing water in from the mountains to supply the city and among other things, to supply Herod's freshwater pool. Now I want to move north to the Valley of Jezreel. The word Jezreel means sown by God. As we look at this picture, we're standing on the top of Mount Carmel looking out over the valley. It's sort of a hazy day on this particular day. The Valley of Jezreel breaks that mountain range of which we spoke earlier, that runs from north to south, and the valley runs sort of from northwest to southeast. What we're going to do is zoom in on that valley. If you stand on the ancient city of Megiddo, which was located at the south end of that valley, and look across, you can see Nazareth on the other side of the valley. Nazareth sat on the edge of the Valley of Jezreel. Here's a map, looking from Megiddo to Nazareth. This was an agricultural economy, shepherds, sheep, farming. Jesus, we're told in some of our translations, we have translated he was the carpenter's son, although the way we ought to translate that phrase, he was a teknon, that is, a builder. In fact, we have the word architect, like chief builder. That tech part refers to somebody who is a builder or a construction worker. The illustrations that Jesus used are very rooted to the soil, to the land. Here's an example of a farmer out there separating the wheat from the tares. He's grinding the grain, just hauling something heavy over that. When he's done, he'll throw it up in the air. The wind will catch the chaff and carry that away, and the heavier kernels of grain will fall to the ground. And Jesus will use that as a part of a parable. Remember, the scriptures talk about Jesus being born and laying in a manger. One of the things that's striking when you actually go to Israel and look at mangers, they are all made of stone. The picture of a wooden manger, that's a purely European concept. In Europe there are lots of trees. You don't have that many trees in Israel, and their wood is quite valuable. And so one thing you do have a lot of in Israel, there's lots of rocks there. And so all mangers would be made of stone. Here's an example of what a first century synagogue how it would have appeared. This one actually is located in Nazareth. It's a sort of a reproduction. You have a small open space and then seating all around. Okay, from Megiddo and Nazareth, we're going to move now to the Sea of Galilee. And the chief city there is still Tiberias today. It was a chief city in Jesus' day, although we have no record of Jesus actually going to Tiberias. The Sea of Galilee is 600 feet below sea level, and the surrounding mountain ranges drop precipitously down into the waters. You can see some of the surrounding mountainsides raising up above sea level, but the Sea of Galilee itself is going to be 600 feet below sea level. Next, we want to swing around the Sea of Galilee to come to Capernaum, because this will be the center of much of the ministry of Jesus. Today, Capernaum is sort of a protected site because of the archaeological ruins that are located there. It was a small village, meaning village of Nahum. Remember the prophet Nahum. There has been discovered a synagogue in Capernaum. However, the ruins that you see here date to the 3rd century AD. However, that synagogue was built over top of an older synagogue. Notice the black basalt rock at the bottom of the synagogue structure, and that was part of the original synagogue that was located beneath the present one. The present one still gives us a picture of what a synagogue would have looked like in that day. This is the 3rd century synagogue in Capernaum. And you can see the black original foundation on which the older synagogue had been built. It really does conform to the same size. However, also notice that the quality of rocks just looks a bit older. Around Capernaum, the housing was formed into what we would call insulas. That is, somebody, you would have a family that lived there, and then as their children would grow up and get married, they would just add on sort of what we might think of as a miniature townhouse. They would add on a room or two to the extended house, and so you have this extended housing all around the tiny village of Capernaum, which means that not only did everybody know everyone else, everyone was more than likely loosely related to everyone else in the town. Some examples of millstones that have been located here. Also on the Sea of Galilee, just a few years back, was discovered a boat dating back to the 1st century AD. They refer to it as the Galilee boat. It was restored as best they could and preserved now in a museum. It gives you perhaps an idea of how rickety some of the craft on the Sea of Galilee might have been. You can begin to understand where if you're out in the middle of that Sea of Galilee and a bit of a wind kicks up, it could be a very dangerous affair. From Capernaum now we want to move north to the ancient site of Laish. It's where Dan had relocated, but especially we want to see the city of Caesarea Philippi. We're moving north along that great Rift Valley, the Hula Valley as it was called. We're coming to the upper waters of the Jordan River, where the snow from Mount Hermon melts, and that melted snow turns to water and feeds the upper reaches of the Jordan. It was here that in times past, King Jeroboam, after the division of the kingdom of Israel into north and south, King Jeroboam had consulted and made 2 golden calves, and he had set one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. We still have the ruins here of the temple. The temple, it was a temple to the Lord, but it was done in a wrong way, using idols for worship, and this was located up here in Dan. And this thing had become a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. So this was not a good place. But here at Laish, you just go around the corner and you find yourself in Caesarea Philippi. That was the location of not just poorly made and theologically incorrect temples to the Lord, but rather these were pagan temples that were constructed by Gentiles to pagan gods. There was a temple to Pan that was located on the edge of this great cliff, this spur from Mount Hermon. You can go to that same cliff today. You can see remnants of the caves. The temple itself, only its foundations remain. Later rabbis would refer to this as the gates of Hades. And it would be here that Jesus would bring his disciples, and they probably wondered, what are we doing here? And he would say to them, upon this rock I will build my church. When Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of God, Jesus would say, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. And he was at the same place, this place of pagan influence. And now we're going to move back down the Jordan River. We're not sure exactly where Jesus was baptized, but we can imagine it taking place along the quiet banks of the Jordan. Here's a very, very old picture, compliments of National Geographic, of the Jordan River. Notice it's a very winding river as it winds its way southward down to the Dead Sea. The entire Jordan River Valley is below sea level. As it finally arrives, just before it empties into the Dead Sea, you can see how it begins to straighten out. Lush and fertile further to the north, not so much as it arrives down and empties into the Dead Sea, remember the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because there's very little in the way of life there. No fish live there. The salt content of the Dead Sea is 5 times that of the ocean. And so this is a dry, arid place. It is the lowest spot on the surface of the earth, 1,400 feet below sea level. It was here that one Jewish community had settled, the community of Qumran. These were a group of separatists who had said, the things that are going on in Jerusalem, they're just way too liberal for us. We need to get away from it all. We need to go out and be pure. And so they moved out here to the desert on the banks or on the shores of the Dead Sea. It was here that we have located the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is Cave 4. Actually, there were a number of caves, and they were numbered in the order in which scrolls were found in them. This particular one was a man-made cave. And all along these caves, scrolls were discovered, sometimes copies of scriptures, sometimes copies of other Jewish writings, and sometimes copies of what we call sectarian scriptures, that is, writings that were written by the Qumran community dealing with their own particular belief system. These caves in which scrolls were located, these scrolls themselves, in some cases, are our very oldest copies of the scriptures, dating 1,000 years earlier than anything we had previously discovered. Truly amazing find by the shores of the Dead Sea. Working our way south, we come to the site of Masada. It's a huge escarpment rising up from the shores of the Dead Sea. I can see the Dead Sea in the background. It was here that Herod the Great had built one of his palaces. It was a great fortress palace. Today there's a nice easygoing cable car to take you up. Back in those days, you would have to walk the winding snake path. Now let's turn to Jerusalem, the city of God. To get there, we move to that central mountain range that lies west of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. In fact, Jerusalem is almost parallel to the northern end of the Dead Sea. It's located about 2,200 feet above sea level. And when you get to Jerusalem, the very first thing you see is nowadays the Dome of the Rock. It's also known as the Mosque of Omar. That was not there, of course, in biblical times. That was the same site. It stands on the same site as where the temple once stood. Here's a map of the topography of Jerusalem, and we have outlined the modern Crusader walls. Now, those walls were not the same that were there in ancient times. I'm just sort of acquainting you with the geography. And if you use your imagination, notice how that the terrain looks perhaps like a upside down mitten with a thumb on our right hand side and that larger part in which our forefingers would go down in the southern center. So that Jerusalem is surrounded on three sides by deep valleys, and then there is a notice the valley on the east, the south, and the west, and then up through the middle of the city there was another valley. This one was known as the Tyropian Valley, the Valley of the Cheesemakers. Although today it's not nearly so deep because it's been filled in over the years by rubble and runoff from rain and things like that. So there's the now we're outlining the city of David. This was the most ancient part of the city. Back in David's day, that comprised the city, and the city gradually grew up to the north and to the west. Here's a scale model. In fact, the model itself is in Jerusalem, and it really helps us to see the city. We're looking at the city from the south. We can see that the Kidron Valley on the to the right in the east, just below us at the bottom of our screen, we see where that Kidron flows into another wadi, another valley, and it goes off our screen. Here we have David's city. This was the oldest part of the city, jutting down from where the Temple Mount eventually would be. It was very steep on three sides, but to the north it led up to some higher ground. In David's city, of course, you always have a water system, and this is no exception. The city actually had a water system leading down, a series of tunnels leading down to some natural springs. In later years, Hezekiah had cut a tunnel that took water from that spring all the way down to the underneath the city wall, so that it could enter the city. As we follow that water spring, we eventually come out to an open concourse, and even to this day, water flows through that. In around 2004, there was a discovery that was made. Actually, some plumbers were working on a large pipe. You can see that pipe in the upper part of our screen, and it had burst, and they dug down to it, and then they noticed some paving stones, and in the subsequent archaeological dig, the steps that you see here were uncovered, and this was in Jesus' day a very large ornate pool, the Pool of Siloam. Here's an artist's conception of what that would have looked like in Jesus' day. Today the site has only been partially excavated. Part of those steps have been uncovered. Much more of it still remains to be uncovered. As we continue to move westward, now we find ourselves in the lower city. This was the poorer section of the city. Going to reposition our map so that we can look at now the upper city. That would have been the richer section. The more wealthy inhabitants of the city lived uphill. In that upper city, today you find a large structure that's commonly known as David's Citadel. The name is named after David, but it was not there in David's day, was not built by him, but it did serve as the foundation of one of three very large towers that Herod the Great had built and that were still standing in Jesus' day. Now, as we go to the northern section of the Temple Mount, we see the Antonia Fortress, built by Herod the Great and named after one of his patrons, Marcus Antonius. You know him as Mark Antony from Julius Caesar fame. Just near the Fortress Antonia, there was the Pool of Bethesda. John chapter 5 records some of the events where Jesus heals a lame man at this pool. And completing our circuit of the Temple Mount, we're going to go up to the Temple Mount in a moment. But here we see the Eastern Gate. Now the present Eastern Gate is sealed up, and it stands over the remains of the ancient gate that would have been there in Jesus' day. The gate that you're seeing here dates more to Crusader times. And of course, looking out to the Mount of Olives across that Kidron Valley. The close-up of the Mount of Olives. To this day, there are olive trees that again grow upon that mountain. Now we come to the base wall around the Temple Mount, and notice there are a number of gates leading into the Temple Mount itself. This is still our model that we are looking at. And most of these gates today are non-existent. We can just find remains of them. Here is the remains of a great arch that once stood that led to a stairway leading up to the top of the Temple Mount. It is known by its discoverer, Robinson's Arch. And we can see how that arch, this is just the bottom part of the arch that we're looking at, how that would have carried a bridge leading up to the Temple Mount. Here again is Robinson's Arch, just from another angle where we can see a portion of that archway. Located down near the ground level, near Robinson's Arch, was an inscription that was found upon, actually the original is now in a museum. This is a museum replica, but they have placed it down where it was originally located. It was tossed down from the top when the temple was destroyed. And the inscription says, "To the place of trumpeting." This may well have been the place where each morning and each evening one of the priests would go up to see if the sun had risen or the sun had set, and blow the trumpet signaling the time for the morning and evening sacrifices. It may have been to this place where Jesus was taken by the devil to be tempted, as the devil said, "Cast yourself from the pinnacle of the temple here, this place of trumpeting, and the angels of God will bear you up." Now we want to look at the west wall. This is the only, well, I'm starting to say it's the only part of the foundational wall that's left standing. And that's not really true. There are other foundational walls, but this is perhaps the best known and closest to the original site of the temple, so it's considered a very holy place for Jews today. Here's what the west wall would have looked like in that day. We're going to outline the part that is showing today. That's the part that's visible when we look at the western wall, which means that the original western wall would have gone much higher and much lower. The ground level went down another 60 feet back in Jesus' day. You can see where that ground level, like I said, in ancient times, the part that they're standing on went much lower. You can see the remains of some of the arches that would have held bridges back in Jesus' day, and you can go back along there and see the extended portion of that wall. As I said, this is a place of reverence and prayer among the Jews today as they come to say their prayers. There's a section over to the south of that that's been reserved for prayers for the women. And in that section that's reserved for the women, notice there's a large crossbeam, which was the lintel of a ancient gate, and then one of the posts, the other post, would be hidden back behind that existing building. This is known as Barclay's Gate. It stood very high. Notice it barely comes up above ground level today, and most of that gate is hidden. So in ancient times, this would have been a massive gate with the ground level being much lower. There's a picture of how Barclay's Gate would have looked in Jesus' day. There would have been steps leading up to this great, massive gate. We see Wilson's Arch. In fact, when I first started seeing pictures of the Western Wall back in the 1960s, Wilson's Arch was covered over by other buildings, and it wasn't until 1967, after the Six-Day War, that some of those buildings had been demolished and were removed, and they found the arch located behind those buildings. If we go into there, we're in for a special treat. We can continue to see both some of the Crusader construction, but we also see the Herodian stones on our left-hand side. There's one place where I'm actually not looking to the side, I'm actually looking straight down with this shot of the camera, and you can see how far down those Herodian stones continue to go. This was looking down to what would have been the ground level in Jesus' day. As I make my way back along the tunnel through that arch, I come to other gates that have been located. Here's another one. And I can follow that all the way up almost to the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. Some of these giant blocks are maybe 20 to 30 feet in length, a single stone block, and these stone foundations that made up that restraining wall, the outer wall of the temple complex. Here is Warren's Gate, still another gate on the western side of that Temple Mount. Now we're going to come out from there and come to the south wall of the Temple Mount. Here's from our model, we can see this south wall, that there were several gates leading up to that area. The steps they've now been uncovered. One can go up the steps. They're a bit irregular. And at the top of these steps were gates. They are now sealed up in stone, but in ancient times these were known as the Huldah gates, named after the prophetess Huldah, going back to Josiah's day. Now the gates weren't that old, but they were named after her. And there were 3 gates on one side and 2 on the other, and these led up. This was the main entrance to the Temple Mount. Here on our map, notice on the model, they have it a little bit wrong. They have 2 gates and 2 gates. As we noted, there's actually 3 on the right and only 2 on the left, as we see the Huldah gates. These Huldah gates led up onto the main platform of the Temple Mount. You can see those there. And as one would come out, you would be faced with the entire structure of the temple, which itself was surrounded by a low retaining wall designed to keep out any Gentiles. There were signs that were placed around this wall saying no Gentiles beyond this point upon pain of death. We've actually found some of the signs in Greek and in Latin. As we come past that retaining wall, that wall of separation, you can see the gate beautiful, and then there is in the foreground the court of the women. That didn't mean that only women were allowed there, but that meant that women were allowed that far. Beyond that, there were 15 steps up leading to the Nicanor gates at the center of our screen, and then would be the court of the men just a little further than that. And beyond that, only the priests were allowed to go. And in the middle of all of that stood the temple proper. The temple stood on the highest point of the mountain. Today, the highest point of the mountain is occupied by the Dome of the Rock, on the exact same spot where the temple once stood. If you stand there on the Temple Mount, look across, the first thing you see to the east, the Mount of Olives. It's actually just a bit higher than the Temple Mount itself, and so the best place to view the Temple Mount would be at the top of the Mount of Olives. Now, I want to talk briefly about the difference between the Old Testament world versus the New Testament world. When the Old Testament ends, there are different geographical regions. There are different countries involved. The Jews had been scattered. When I come to the New Testament world, we already noted that very gradually we're going to start there in Israel, but our attention will begin to take in places like modern-day Turkey and Greece and eventually Italy. And so we're dealing with substantially different geographical regions. There are different languages involved. In the Old Testament, that's written primarily in Hebrew. There's a few chapters in Daniel that have some Aramaic. When I come to the New Testament is written in Greek, and indeed, even though Aramaic was still a common language in the Middle East, it is now Greek that so often is the official language, so that all our earliest manuscripts, our earliest copies of the New Testament, are all written in Greek. Different national invaders. In the Old Testament, I had countries like Assyria, and then Babylon, and finally the Persians that held sway over the land of Israel. That's all a thing of the past when we come to the New Testament. Now Rome is the superpower in the Middle East. Different types of literature. One of the things that I've come into as we get to our New Testament world is the advent of historical literature. It's said sometimes that Herodotus was the father of history, and he's actually writing at the very end of the Old Testament era. But now that type of writing has been popularized so that historical writing is a thing to be expected. Now, those are some of the differences. What are some of the similarities between the Old and the New Testament? Well, first of all, both of them speak of a covenant. The covenant idea transcends Old and New Testament. It is throughout both Old and New Testament. Secondly, both are of a historical value. Even though we described Herodotus as the father of history, or Greek scholars like to call him that, you had history going many hundreds of years earlier than that, and the Old Testament gives us great historical value, as does the New Testament. Both the Old and the New Testament attest to Christ. Now, the way you say that in Hebrew, you call him Messiah, or we can use the Greek term Christ, the anointed one, the promised one, and of course he's promised in the Old Testament. Those promises are fulfilled in the New Testament.